Hey, this is LT. What's going on, family? So, I had a video already set aside to release today, but I just didn't have the grace in my heart to release it. So, I want to release what God is speaking in my heart for me to release. So, this just a warning up front. This video is gonna have a lot of ruffled feathers and some stepped on toes, but I need you to see the heart behind it. I need you to hear the love behind it. And when you recognize love, you know that He never fails. When you recognize love speaking, you know that it's not a person that's speaking a message. You can tell that uh, people who know His voice, they know who He is. So I just want to start with when I was a kid. Hey, I used to get into a lot of fights all the time. In fact, when I went to Morrow Middle School, the very first day, there were people who were stacked up, ready to fight me every single day because they didn't like how I looked, how I dressed, how I talked. So what's really crazy is that the older I got, especially in the eighth grade, I realized that I was gravitating towards hanging around with certain people. And what's really interesting is I came from a party one time. I'll never forget this. And some of you guys, you know my story. I came from a party and hey, I had a group of guys who tracked me down like a group of wolves and sucker punched me. And next thing you know, hey, they would beat me senseless to the place where I was almost totally unconscious. And one of the guys picked me up and threw me and told me to get out of there. And I'm thankful even to this day for him being able to have the courage to pick me up around people who were trying to harm me. But for some reason, I gravitated towards those type of people. I gravitated towards gang members. I gravitated towards people because they were connected and they were friendly. So when it came down to certain things like things that we did that was consistent, you know, we had a lot in common. We love women. Everybody loves women. But then also, you know, they smoked weed, they drank, you know, they did all type of different things. They shot dice, and I was like, okay, we got all this stuff in common. So I used to hang out with these dudes all the time. And there was a guy that I hung out with my brother Lamont. This guy's name was Dooney. And one day I'll never forget, we went up to the mall, and the first thing Dooney says is he looks back at me. He's like, hey, you know what? Hey, something goes down up here. We all fighting. You know the rule. And I'm like, okay, let's do what we got to do. I'm ready to scrap. It's one of those things. See, I was not a gang member, but since I was affiliated with them, that's what they call the wannabe. And I didn't necessarily want to be part of the gang. I just wanted the benefits that was associated with the gang. You know, that's pretty much what it came down to. So my life totally changed though, is that one day when I saw that Dooney had got shot and killed, and I realized that there were people in this world who were willing to die for what they believed in, even though it might have been something that was totally different. It's a gang activity, it's gang violence. I get that part. But there's people who are willing to die for what they believe in. And I want you to see this line, this parallel um, into what we're talking about. So I went from the guy who was the wannabe, and I realized that there's people who are willing to give their life. That was a turning place for me. That got me to where I just start focusing on playing basketball. A lot of things start changing in my life and my attitude, you know. But when I saw that, a switch came on. So I was listening to Pastor Chen the other day, and he was talking about how he flew to China, and he was a guest speaker, and the people who came to pick him up from the airport, he said, well, let's go to the gathering. I'm ready to go. I'm excited. He said, well, you have to leave your team. We can only take one or two of you because it's illegal for you to be here in the first place. It's illegal for you to be a Christian in this country. It's illegal for you to carry that Bible. It's illegal. And the gathering that we're going to is not a place to where the people of this country would approve. So he grabbed his daughter. In fact, he made a joke. He said, I'll take her. She's the most expendable. And they head over to this gathering. Now he goes downstairs and he says they're in the basement. And the power of God meets him when he comes downstairs. And he's looking at this worship session and he's just waiting, just loving the flow of the wave of the Holy Spirit. And then finally they said, well, it's time for you to come talk. And he's looking out and he's like, well, I don't really know your culture. I don't really know what's going on. I don't know what it's like to see persecution. He said, can you do me a favor and can you give me some stories of what you go through? And they looked at him and they said, why do you want to hear our stories about us? And he just, well, it's something that we don't necessarily deal with. He's like, I would love to hear some stories. Now, let me explain something. That's like your favorite rapper or musician coming up and they have the microphone and they're like, go ahead and sing my song. Come on. They pay for this guy to come out here, right? So they want to hear from him. So he's sitting there and they start telling these stories about pastors being taken out of their household, being kidnapped, being beat. He talked about gatherings that are being broken up and police coming and they're chasing people, jumping fences, and his eyes are getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And he's like, oh my gosh, this is wild. This is crazy. And story after story, another person would tell a story. Another person would tell a story. Oh, wow, are you playing with me? This is really happening? He's like, yeah, this happens all the time. Then he stopped and the guy said, so what's church like in America? And he said, we have these buildings and we gather in the building and we sing some songs. And if a person doesn't like how you sing or how you preach, then they go to another church or another building. And we come together and after a couple hours, we go home. He said they start cracking up. They start laughing. Just they couldn't stop laughing. It was hysteric to them. And they're like, oh my gosh, you've got to be playing. And what's really crazy is that his daughter on a drive home said that was the craziest thing I've ever seen. That just didn't make sense. That was kind of odd. And Pastor Chan explained, he said, you know why they said it, right? He says, because they don't understand how we got what we do from this. They don't get it. It doesn't make sense to them. What we do does not reflect what this is saying, what's going on in here. So to us, in the rest of the world, we see things on two different perspectives. We are a whole 4% of the population of the world, and this is how we hold church. And they're out being the church. And this persecution is coming at them. And the glory of God is following them everywhere they go. That's the difference. Pastor Bill, he made a statement. He said, we come to the church to gather around a sermon. He said, but Israel, when they were in the wilderness, they came to gather around the presence. We gotta get back to the presence of God being the most important thing. We got to get back to the presence of God where God is orchestrating our daily activity to where they know without a shadow of a doubt God is in everything that you do. Guys, I spent an amazing time last night just worshiping, just at work, and I'm worshiping and I'm praising God, and people are looking at me sideways and I don't care, and I'm worshiping God and I'm just loving on him, and his presence just came right where I was at and said, okay, now let's talk about what we're going to talk about. And this whole entire conversation was so clear to my heart. He said, we just had coronavirus. We just had this whole COVID thing. Well, the walls of the church were broken down and people came out of the church and they changed people's lives. And we had food drives, and there's so many things that happened out of this pandemic. He said, but now people are flocking back into the sanctuary and they're forgetting what just happened. We're going back into where we came from. Instead of going to live out being the church, being what Christ called us to walk in. He said, go into all the world and preach the gospel. Our life is a reflection of his mandate and what he told us to walk in. So, are we going to take this and run with it? And are we going to just basically say, okay, that was just something that we went through? I want you to ask yourself a question. As pastors, as preachers, as teachers, there's evangelists, there's people who have your own congregation, people who are bishops. I want you to ask yourself this question. This Sunday, I want you to go to 5 to 10 random people that are partitioners of your church, random people, and ask them a question. Ask them this exact question. What's the vision that God gave me for the church? And what's your part in the vision? What's the vision that God gave me for this church? And what's your part in the vision? And see if they can locate themselves in what God spoke to you to manifest. And it all starts with, am I willing to die for this? Or are we just walking around as wannabes?